It was a quiet afternoon on the outskirts of a small town, the kind of place where time seemed to move a little slower. The sky above was a calm shade of blue, with only a few clouds lazily drifting by. The roads were lined with trees whose leaves swayed gently in the breeze, creating patterns of light and shadow on the asphalt. Marcus Price, a man of steady habits and even steadier nerves, drove along these winding roads, his silver sedan humming softly under him. Marcus was on his way home after spending the weekend with his grandchildren. They were the light of his life, their laughter a kind of music that reminded him why he'd worked so hard all those years. He could still hear their voices in his mind, calling him Grandpa and asking him to play one more game before he left. A small smile touched his lips as he thought about the way they'd hugged him tightly before he got into his car. Dressed in a plain shirt and worn jeans, Marcus looked like any ordinary man. His salt and pepper hair was neatly trimmed, and his posture was relaxed as he gripped the steering wheel with one hand. But looks could be deceiving. Marcus had lived a life that most people couldn't imagine. For over 30 years, he had worked for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, solving some of the country's most difficult cases. His job had taken him to places both beautiful and dangerous, and he had seen the best and worst of humanity. But now, in retirement, he preferred a simpler life, spending time with his family and enjoying the peace he had earned. The quiet of the drive was suddenly broken by a sharp sound, a siren. It wasn't loud at first, just a faint wail in the distance. Marcus glanced in his rearview mirror and saw red and blue lights flashing behind him. A police car was tailing him, its front grille almost gleaming in the sunlight. Marcus sighed. Not out of fear, but out of annoyance. He'd been here before. The patrol car signaled for him to pull over, and Marcus did so without hesitation. He guided his sedan to the side of the road, coming to a smooth stop. He turned off the engine, placed both hands on the steering wheel, and waited. He wasn't the kind of man to panic in situations like this. Years of FBI training had taught him to stay calm, no matter what. The officer stepped out of the patrol car and approached Marcus's vehicle. He was a young man, probably in his late 20s, with a neatly pressed uniform and a pair of mirrored sunglasses perched on his nose. His walk was brisk, and his shoulders were squared, as though he carried the weight of authority with pride or perhaps with inexperience. When the officer reached the driver's side window, Marcus rolled it down slowly. "Good afternoon," the officer said, his tone curt. "License and registration, please." Marcus nodded and reached for his wallet, which sat on the passenger seat. His movements were deliberate, almost slow, so there would be no misunderstanding. He retrieved his driver's license and handed it to the officer. As the officer examined the license, his eyes flicked to Marcus and then back to the card. "Where are you headed today?" he asked, his voice lacking any warmth. "Home," Marcus replied simply. His voice was calm, steady. "Been driving out here often?" the officer asked, his tone shifting slightly. "Occasionally," Marcus said, his face unreadable. The officer's eyes narrowed slightly, as though he were trying to size Marcus up. His fingers tapped lightly on the edge of the car door. "Mind if I take a look in the trunk?" Marcus raised an eyebrow, his expression still calm but now tinged with curiosity. "Is there a reason for that?" he asked. "Just a routine check," the officer replied, his tone clipped. Marcus leaned back slightly, his hands still resting on the steering wheel. He had been in situations like this before, though under much more serious circumstances. This felt unnecessary, an exercise in authority rather than genuine concern. Still, he decided to cooperate, at least for now. "Go ahead," Marcus said, his voice measured. The officer nodded and stepped back. Marcus pressed the button to release the trunk latch, and the officer walked to the back of the car. Through the rearview mirror, Marcus watched him. The officer's movements were sharp and purposeful, but there was something about them that felt overly deliberate, as though he were trying to make a point. As the officer began searching through the trunk, Marcus allowed his thoughts to wander. He had spent decades learning to read people, understanding their motivations and fears. It was a skill that had served him well in his career. And now, watching this young officer, Marcus couldn't help but wonder what had led to this stop. Was it simple routine, or was there something else at play? The officer's hands moved over the items in the trunk: an overnight bag, a folded blanket, and a small black case that was locked. When he reached the case, the officer paused. "What's in here?" the officer asked, holding up the case. "Personal property," Marcus replied. The officer frowned, his grip tightening on the handle of the case. "I'm going to need you to open this." Marcus's expression didn't change, but his voice carried a hint of steel as he responded. "Are you sure about that?" The officer hesitated for a moment, as though unsure how to proceed. But then he straightened his shoulders and said, "Step out of the vehicle." Marcus sighed again, this time a bit deeper. He opened the door and stepped out, his movements unhurried. He stood by the side of the road, his hands at his sides, as the officer examined the case more closely. "You see," Marcus said, his voice calm but with an edge of authority, "before you go any further, you might want to know who you're dealing with." The officer glanced at him, his expression a mix of curiosity and suspicion. Marcus reached into his back pocket and pulled out a small leather wallet. He flipped it open, revealing a badge that gleamed in the sunlight. "FBI." "Retired," Marcus said, his tone even but firm. The officer's face changed instantly. His eyes widened, and his posture stiffened. He looked from the badge to Marcus and back again, the realization of his mistake dawning on him like a slow-moving storm. Marcus held the officer's gaze, his expression calm but unyielding. "Now," he said, "do you still want me to open that case?" The officer stammered, his confidence evaporating. "And no, sir," he managed to say. Marcus nodded and closed the trunk himself, his movements deliberate. He didn't say anything more, letting the weight of the moment settle over the officer. As Marcus got back into his car, the officer stepped back, his face pale. The siren lights flickered off, and Marcus started the engine. Driving away, Marcus allowed himself a small, wry smile. Some lessons, he thought, had to be learned the hard way. The officer stood tall, his posture rigid as he approached Marcus's car. He couldn't have been much older than 25, the kind of young man who carried his badge like a shield and his uniform like a suit of armor. His mirrored sunglasses hid his eyes, but Marcus didn't need to see them to sense the judgment lurking behind them. The sun was high in the sky, casting sharp shadows across the quiet road. The officer's tone was clipped as he barked, "License and registration." Marcus didn't react immediately. He wasn't the kind of man who rushed under pressure, especially not from someone like this. His hands stayed on the wheel for a beat longer, a deliberate gesture to show he wasn't in any hurry. Slowly, he reached for his wallet, which was resting on the passenger seat. "Here you go," Marcus said calmly, handing over the requested documents. His voice was even, with no trace of hostility or fear. The officer took the papers without a word, his movements sharp and mechanical. He examined Marcus's license for a long moment, his brow furrowing slightly. "Driving out here often?" the officer asked, his tone casual but with an edge of suspicion. "Occasionally," Marcus replied. His tone remained calm, but there was a firmness to it, a quiet confidence that suggested he wasn't someone who could be easily intimidated. The officer's gaze lingered on Marcus longer than necessary. His lips pressed into a thin line, and his fingers tapped lightly on the edge of the license. He glanced at the car, then back at Marcus, his expression unreadable but tense. Without any explanation, the officer took a step back from the window and began circling the car. His boots crunched against the gravel at the edge of the road, the sound sharp in the still afternoon air. "Pop the trunk," he ordered suddenly, his voice carrying a note of authority. Marcus arched an eyebrow at the command. He turned his head slightly to watch the officer, his expression calm but questioning. "Is there a reason for this?" Marcus asked, his tone measured. "Routine check," the officer snapped, not even looking at Marcus as he spoke. Marcus let out a slow breath, feeling a flicker of irritation rise in his chest. It wasn't the first time he'd been in a situation like this, and he doubted it would be the last. Years ago, he might have brushed it off, chalked it up to an officer just doing his job. But Marcus had seen too much of the world, had dealt with too many people who thought power was theirs simply because they wore a uniform. "Routine check," Marcus repeated softly to himself, almost as if testing the words. He placed his hand on the button to release the trunk but didn't press it just yet. "Look," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm, "I'm happy to cooperate. But I have to ask, what exactly are you looking for?" The officer stopped his pacing and turned to face Marcus, his hands resting on his hips. His sunglasses reflected the bright sunlight, making it impossible to see his eyes. "Just doing my job," the officer said, his tone dismissive. Marcus studied him for a moment, his sharp instincts kicking in. This wasn't about a routine check. The officer's posture, his clipped tone, the way his fingers fidgeted with the edge of his belt, it all pointed to something else. Suspicion. Prejudice. Marcus wasn't a stranger to it. Still, he pressed the button, and the trunk popped open with a soft click. The officer moved to the back of the car without another word. Through the side mirror, Marcus watched as the officer rummaged through the trunk. His hands moved over a folded blanket, a neatly packed overnight bag, and a few tools that Marcus always kept for emergencies. Nothing unusual. Nothing out of place. But the officer's movements were slow and deliberate, as though he were searching for something specific. Then the officer paused, his hand resting on a small black case tucked neatly in the corner of the trunk. He picked it up and turned it over in his hands, his fingers brushing against the metal latches. "What's in here?" the officer asked, holding up the case for Marcus to see. "Personal property," Marcus replied evenly. The officer raised an eyebrow, his grip tightening on the handle of the case. "I'm going to need you to open this," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Marcus stayed silent for a moment, his gaze steady as he looked at the officer. Inside, he felt a familiar churn of irritation. It wasn't fear. Marcus didn't scare easily. It was the principle of the thing. "Are you sure about that?" Marcus asked, his voice calm but with a sharp edge that hinted at his experience. The officer hesitated for just a moment, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. But he recovered quickly, straightening his posture and nodding firmly. "Yes, sir. I'm sure." Marcus sighed softly and stepped out of the car. His movements were slow and deliberate, not rushed or defensive. He stood beside the car, his hands resting loosely at his sides as he looked at the officer. "Look," Marcus said, his tone still calm but now carrying a note of authority, "I've been patient. I've answered your questions, handed over my documents, and even opened my trunk. But now, I think it's time you tell me what this is really about." The officer's jaw tightened, and he shifted uncomfortably under Marcus's steady gaze. For a moment, the young man looked unsure of himself, his earlier confidence wavering. "I'm just following protocol," the officer said finally, though his voice lacked the conviction it had carried earlier. Marcus let out a short, quiet laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Protocol," he repeated, shaking his head slightly. "You and I both know that's not what this is about." The officer opened his mouth to respond but closed it again, seemingly at a loss for words. Marcus took a step closer, his posture still relaxed but his presence commanding. "Let me save you some trouble," he said, reaching into his back pocket. The officer tensed, his hand moving instinctively toward his belt. Relax, Marcus said, holding up a hand to show he meant no harm. He pulled out a small leather wallet and flipped it open, revealing a gleaming badge inside. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Retired, Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. The officer's face changed in an instant. His eyes widened, and his posture stiffened as he realized who he was dealing with. Marcus held the badge up for a moment longer before tucking it back into his pocket. He didn't say anything else, letting the weight of the moment settle over the officer. After a long pause, the officer cleared his throat. I didn't realize, he stammered. No, Marcus said, his voice quiet but pointed. You didn't. The officer took a step back, his confidence now replaced with something closer to embarrassment. Marcus didn't move, didn't say another word. He simply stood there, letting the silence do the talking. It wasn't about making a scene or proving a point, it was about teaching a lesson that the officer wouldn't forget. Finally, Marcus turned and walked back to his car. He opened the door, slid into the driver's seat, and closed it behind him. He started the engine and pulled back onto the road, leaving the officer standing in the dust. As he drove away, Marcus let out a slow breath, the tension easing from his shoulders. He wasn't angry, not really. He had seen enough of the world to know that change came slowly. But he couldn't help but wonder how many others had faced the same situation without the badge, without the authority to push back. The officer held the small locked case in his hand, turning it over as though it contained the answers to all his suspicions. His lips curled into a faint smirk, the kind that implied he believed he had found something incriminating. The young officer had clearly decided that this was his moment to assert control. "What's this?" the officer asked, lifting the case higher for emphasis. Marcus didn't flinch. His gaze was steady, calm, almost disinterested. "Personal property," he replied. "Looks like something I need to open," the officer said, his voice a mix of bravado and uncertainty as he reached toward his utility belt. Marcus raised a brow, his calm demeanor taking on a sharper edge. His voice, though still measured, cut through the tension like a blade. "You sure about that, officer?" For a moment, the officer hesitated. The shift in Marcus's tone wasn't loud or confrontational, it was quiet, deliberate, and unyielding. It was the kind of tone that made people stop and think, even if they didn't know why. The young officer straightened his shoulders, trying to regain his composure. "I'll need you to step out of the vehicle," he barked, but the command lacked its previous force. Marcus didn't argue. With the same quiet grace he had displayed all along, he opened the car door and stepped out. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if he had all the time in the world. There was no sign of nervousness in his posture, no urgency in his movements. Instead, he radiated a calm confidence that seemed to unsettle the officer. Standing beside the car, Marcus clasped his hands in front of him and fixed the officer with a steady gaze. He wasn't towering or physically intimidating, but there was something about his presence, an unshakable calm that made the officer falter. The officer held the case tightly, his fingers gripping the edges as though it were a lifeline. He cleared his throat, then spoke. "Sir, I need you to unlock this case. Now." Marcus tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Do you have probable cause?" The officer blinked, caught off guard by the question. "This is a routine check," he said, his tone defensive. "Routine?" Marcus repeated, his voice carrying just a hint of skepticism. "You've searched my trunk, inspected my belongings, and now you're insisting on opening something that's clearly private. If that's routine, I'd hate to see what extraordinary looks like." The officer's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not by someone who was supposed to be the one answering questions. "Are you refusing to cooperate?" the officer asked, his tone sharpening. Marcus let out a soft sigh, as though he were dealing with a particularly stubborn child. "No, Officer. I'm simply asking you to explain the legal grounds for your request. You know, as required by law. The officer's cheeks flushed a deep red, the color creeping up his neck. He was young, inexperienced, and clearly out of his depth. But instead of backing down, he doubled down, gripping the case tighter and glaring at Marcus. This isn't a debate, the officer snapped. You either open this case, or I'll have to take further action. Marcus held his ground, his expression calm but firm. And what action would that be? The officer opened his mouth to respond but closed it again, seemingly at a loss for words. After a long moment of tense silence, Marcus reached into his pocket. The officer tensed, his hand darting toward his holster. Relax, Marcus said, holding up both hands to show he meant no harm. Slowly, he pulled out a small leather wallet. He opened it with deliberate care, revealing the badge inside. Federal Bureau of Investigation, Marcus said, his voice calm and steady. Retired, but the authorities still there. The officer froze, his face a mix of shock and embarrassment. He stared at the badge as though it had materialized out of thin air. Marcus closed the wallet and slipped it back into his pocket. Now, he said, his tone taking on an edge of authority, I'd like you to explain why you stopped me in the first place. The officer stammered, his earlier confidence crumbling. I didn't realize, he said finally. No, Marcus said, his voice quiet but firm. You didn't. But that doesn't excuse the way you've handled this situation. The officer shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting around as though looking for an escape. Marcus didn't move. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to fill the space with an unspoken demand for accountability. This case, Marcus said, gesturing toward the locked box in the officer's hand, contains documents from my years in the Bureau. Classified documents. If you had opened it, you would have been violating federal law. The officer's eyes widened, and he quickly set the case back in the trunk. He straightened up, brushing off his uniform as though trying to compose himself. I apologize, sir, the officer said, his tone now noticeably more respectful. Marcus gave a small nod, his expression unreadable. Apology accepted, he said. But let this be a lesson. Judging people by appearances can lead to serious mistakes. The officer nodded quickly, his earlier arrogance now replaced with a mix of humility and embarrassment. Without another word, Marcus closed the trunk and returned to the driver's seat. He started the engine, pulled back onto the road, and drove away, leaving the officer standing in the dust. As the car disappeared over the horizon, Marcus couldn't help but shake his head. It wasn't the first time he had encountered someone who let power go to their head, and he doubted it would be the last. But as he drove on, he felt a quiet satisfaction knowing he had turned the moment into a teaching experience not just for the officer, but for anyone who might hear the story later. And he knew the story would be told. After all, lessons like these had a way of spreading far beyond the moment they were taught. The young officer's hand trembled slightly as he gripped the edge of the trunk, still staring at the locked case as though it might hold something explosive. His bravado had carried him this far, but now it was faltering under the steady gaze of Marcus Price, a man who was clearly not ordinary. Open the case, the officer repeated, though his tone lacked its earlier authority. Marcus leaned against the side of his car, his movements slow and deliberate. He took a deep breath, his expression remaining calm but slightly amused, as though he were humoring a child playing dress-up. Are you absolutely sure you want to do this? Marcus asked, his voice low but sharp, cutting through the growing tension. The officer's jaw tightened, his pride visibly battling with his uncertainty. Yes, I'm sure. Open it now. Marcus chuckled softly, not out of amusement but as a way of releasing the irritation bubbling beneath his calm surface. He reached into his back pocket and retrieved a sleek, leather wallet. The officer instinctively stiffened, his hand hovering near his holster. Marcus paused, his eyes flickering to the officer's hand. "Relax," he said, his voice steady. "I'm not armed. I'm just retrieving something you'll want to see." Slowly, Marcus opened the wallet and turned it toward the officer. Inside was a badge, its polished surface catching the sunlight. The letters FBI gleamed as if they had been etched in steel for this very moment. The officer's face drained of color. He blinked, once, twice, as though trying to process what he was seeing. "Wait. What?" Marcus's smile widened just slightly, though his eyes remained hard. "Marcus Price," he said, tapping the badge with a finger. "Retired FBI special agent. 30 years of service, including counterintelligence and internal affairs. That means I know exactly what's legal and what's not. Do you?" The officer stepped back as though the badge itself had pushed him. I didn't know," he stammered, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. "That much is clear," Marcus said, his tone now firm and unyielding. He snapped the wallet shut and slipped it back into his pocket. "Now, let me explain something to you. That personal property in the trunk? It contains classified documents from my time in the Bureau. If you had opened it without proper clearance, you'd have been committing a federal offense. And trust me, those don't just disappear with an apology." The officer swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. His gaze darted to the trunk, then back to Marcus. I didn't mean to. I thought." "You thought what?" Marcus interrupted, his voice like a whip. "You thought you'd found some big fish? A reason to flex your authority? Or was it something else? Something about me that made you think you could push your luck?" The officer opened his mouth to respond but closed it again, clearly at a loss for words. "I've seen this 100 times, Marcus continued, stepping closer. His calm demeanor had returned, but his words carried the weight of experience. A young officer, fresh out of training, hungry to prove himself. "But here's a piece of advice you'll thank me for later: respect the badge. Yours and everyone else's. Because the moment you forget that, you lose the trust that comes with it." The officer nodded quickly, his eyes fixed on the ground. "Yes, sir. I understand. Do you?" Marcus pressed, tilting his head slightly. "Because right now, it doesn't look like you do. You saw a man driving a car, assumed something about him, and decided to act on those assumptions without any real cause. That's not just bad policing, that's dangerous." The officer's face was now as red as the tail lights of Marcus's car. I made a mistake," he admitted quietly. Marcus let the silence stretch, letting the weight of the moment settle. Then he nodded. "Good. Recognizing a mistake is the first step to fixing it. Now, let's move on to step 2. The officer looked up, his expression hopeful. "What's that?" "Accountability," Marcus said simply. The word hit like a hammer. The officer straightened, his embarrassment now laced with determination. "What do you want me to do?" Marcus gestured toward the trunk. "Close it. Then we'll talk." The officer quickly complied, shutting the trunk with a careful hand as though it were made of glass. He turned back to Marcus, his earlier arrogance replaced by genuine humility. "I'm sorry," the officer said again, his voice steady this time. "I overstepped. It won't happen again." Marcus studied him for a moment, then gave a single nod. "Good. Apology accepted. But remember this moment. Because next time, you might not be lucky enough to pull over someone willing to teach you a lesson instead of making an example out of you." The officer's eyes widened slightly, and he nodded. "Yes, sir. I will." Marcus stepped toward the driver's side door but paused before getting in. "One last thing," he said, turning back to the officer. The young man looked up expectantly. "Every person you pull over is a human being," Marcus said. "Treat them with respect until they give you a reason not to. You'll find it makes your job and your life a lot easier." With that, Marcus got into his car and started the engine. He didn't rush as he pulled back onto the road, leaving the officer standing alone in the dust. As he drove away, Marcus felt a sense of satisfaction not just because he had handled the situation without escalating it, but because he had turned it into a moment of growth for someone who clearly needed it. He glanced in the rearview mirror one last time, watching the officer standing there, a small figure against the wide, empty road. For Marcus, this was more than just an encounter. It was a reminder that even the most frustrating situations could be opportunities to teach, to guide, and to lead. And in the quiet hum of his car, Marcus allowed himself a small, knowing smile. Retired or not, he murmured to himself, the work's never really done. Marcus eased the car back onto the smooth asphalt, the afternoon sunlight glinting off the windshield. The small town was still ahead, quiet and unbothered, yet Marcus's mind was sharp, replaying the incident in his head. He wasn't angry. No, anger wasn't something he allowed to dominate him. It was the principle that gnawed at him, the blatant misuse of authority by someone who should have known better. As he drove, the scenery around him blurred into a mix of golden fields and scattered trees. But Marcus wasn't focused on the beauty of the countryside. His thoughts were locked on the officer, a young man who had walked into a situation with more assumptions than sense. It wasn't the first time Marcus had dealt with such behavior, and he doubted it would be the last. It had been years since Marcus left the bureau, but his instincts were still razor sharp. He thought back to the countless times he had trained young recruits, teaching them how to balance authority with respect. He had seen so many like the officer fresh out of training, full of bravado, desperate to prove themselves. But the eagerness often masks something deeper, insecurity. Authority isn't a weapon, Marcus had told countless recruits. It's a responsibility. You don't use it to tear people down, you use it to protect, to guide, and to serve. He sighed, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. The memory of that lesson was a stark contrast to what he'd just experienced. That officer hadn't been trained by someone like Marcus, clearly. Or if he had, he hadn't been paying attention. Marcus glanced at the speedometer, easing the car just below the speed limit. He didn't need any more attention from local law enforcement, even if he was confident in his ability to handle whatever came his way. The road stretched out ahead, and the hum of the engine filled the silence. Marcus allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. Marcus had spent decades in situations far more intense than today's roadside encounter. He'd faced down criminals, negotiated with volatile informants, and worked undercover in dangerous environments where a single wrong move could have ended his life. Compared to those moments, today's incident was almost laughable. But it was also personal. The officer hadn't just pulled over any man, he had pulled over a black man driving a decent car on an empty road. Marcus knew the dynamics at play. He'd faced them before, even while wearing the bureau badge. Authority didn't shield him from prejudice, and retirement hadn't erased the way people saw him. His mind drifted back to a particular case in the 1990s when he had been working undercover in a sting operation. He'd been surveilling a corrupt local police force, documenting their illegal activities while pretending to be a low-level criminal. The assignment had been one of the most challenging of his career, not because of the danger, but because of the way he'd been treated by those sworn to uphold the law. He remembered the scornful looks, the casual slurs, and the assumptions made about his character based solely on his appearance. Even as he gathered evidence to dismantle their operation, he had to endure their disdain, biting his tongue until the moment came to reveal his true identity. And oh, what a moment that had been! The memory brought a small smile to Marcus's lips. The look on their faces when he flashed his badge when they realized the man they had dismissed and mistreated was the one who had brought their entire operation crashing down was priceless. Today's situation wasn't nearly as dramatic, but the dynamics were the same. The officer had made assumptions, wielded his authority recklessly, and walked straight into a confrontation he wasn't prepared for. Marcus's thoughts were interrupted by the vibration of his phone in the cup holder. At the next stop sign, he glanced at the screen. It was a message from an old colleague, one of his closest friends from the bureau days. "Let's catch up soon. Got a project I want to run by you." Marcus raised an eyebrow. A project? It wasn't unusual for his former colleagues to reach out. Retirement didn't always mean leaving the work behind. He typed a quick response before setting the phone back down. As he drove, the message lingered in his mind. He'd been retired for a while now, enjoying the slower pace of life, spending time with family, and taking long drives like this one. But there was a part of him that missed the work, the sense of purpose that came with protecting and serving, not as a figure of authority, but as someone who made a difference. And perhaps that's what bothered him most about the officer he'd encountered today. It wasn't just the lack of respect, it was the wasted opportunity. That young man had a badge and the power to change lives for the better. Instead, he'd chosen to wield it like a weapon, assuming the worst about the people he encountered. Marcus shook his head, the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him. Miles passed, and the small town finally came into view, a cluster of homes, a gas station, and a diner with a flickering neon sign. Marcus pulled into the diner's parking lot, deciding a cup of coffee would do him good. Inside, the smell of fresh brewed coffee and sizzling bacon greeted him. The place was quiet, save for a couple of truckers at the counter and an older couple in a corner booth. Marcus found a seat by the window, ordered his coffee, and leaned back in his chair. As he waited, his mind wandered back to the officer. He couldn't shake the thought that their interaction could have gone very differently. What if Marcus hadn't been as calm? What if he hadn't had the badge to defuse the situation? The idea troubled him. Not for his own sake, he could handle himself, but for others who might find themselves in similar situations without the same resources or experience. When the waitress brought his coffee, Marcus offered a polite smile and thanked her. He stirred in a packet of sugar, his thoughts churning as he sipped. By the time Marcus left the diner, the sun was starting to dip toward the horizon. He climbed back into his car, but he didn't start the engine right away. Instead, he sat there, his hands resting on the steering wheel as an idea began to take shape. That officer wasn't the only one who needed a lesson in accountability. Marcus had spent years teaching recruits, guiding them, showing them how to wield their authority with integrity. Maybe it was time to bring those lessons back, not just to the police force, but to the communities they served. Marcus smiled to himself, his earlier frustration giving way to a sense of purpose. Retirement didn't mean his work was done. There was still plenty to do, and now he had the time to do it. As he pulled back onto the road, his destination clear, Marcus couldn't help but feel a renewed sense of determination. Today's encounter wasn't just a reminder of the challenges that remained, it was a call to action. A quiet evening. When Marcus finally reached his home, a modest but comfortable house on a tree-lined street, he was greeted by the familiar wag of his dog's tail. Rufus, a loyal Labrador retriever, bounded up to him, his excitement washing away some of the tension that still clung to Marcus's shoulders. "Hey, boy," Marcus murmured, kneeling to scratch behind Rufus's ears. "Had a long day, huh?" Inside, the house was quiet except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Marcus set his keys on the kitchen counter and poured himself a glass of water. The stillness was welcome, giving him space to think. But as he sat down in his favorite chair, Rufus curling up at his feet, Marcus couldn't help but replay the encounter in his mind. The officer's face, the way it had shifted from arrogance to shock, was burned into his memory. He wasn't angry anymore. What he felt now was something deeper, a mix of sadness and determination. That night, as Marcus prepared for bed, an idea began to form. It wasn't enough to simply walk away from situations like this. He had a responsibility, not just because of who he was but because of what he had learned over the years. He thought back to the young recruits he had mentored during his time with the Bureau. Many of them had started out like that officer, full of ambition but lacking in understanding. What had made the difference for them was guidance, someone to show them the right way to wield authority. Marcus grabbed a notepad from his bedside table and began jotting down ideas. Community workshops, sessions where officers and residents could come together to discuss real-life scenarios and build mutual respect. Mentorship programs, pairing young officers with experienced mentors who could teach them the importance of empathy and restraint. Policy reform, advocating for changes within local departments to ensure accountability and proper training. As the list grew, Marcus felt a sense of purpose reigniting within him. Retirement didn't mean he was done making a difference. If anything, it meant he had the time and freedom to focus on what truly mattered. By sunrise, Marcus was already at his desk, typing up a proposal. The words flowed easily, his experience giving weight to every suggestion. He planned to start locally, working with the town's police department and community leaders to implement his ideas. He made a call to an old friend, Captain Teresa Morales, who now headed the local precinct. Teresa had always been a straight shooter, someone who valued justice over politics. If anyone could help him get this initiative off the ground, it was her. Marcus, Teresa greeted warmly when she picked up. "It's been too long. What's on your mind?" Marcus explained the encounter with the officer, leaving out no details. Teresa listened intently, her occasional hum signaling her agreement. "You're right," she said when he finished. "We've got some young officers who could use a wake-up call. Let's meet and talk this through." Over the next few weeks, Marcus and Teresa worked closely together. They organized meetings with local leaders, bringing together voices from all sides of the community. Marcus shared stories from his time in the FBI, using them to highlight the importance of perspective and restraint. One evening, during a community workshop, Marcus stood before a group of officers and residents. The room was tense, the divide between the two groups palpable. Marcus started with a question. "How many of you have ever felt judged based on how you look or where you come from?" Hands went up on both sides of the room, hesitantly at first but then more confidently. Marcus nodded, his gaze sweeping the crowd. "Now, how many of you have judged someone else without knowing their story?" The room grew quiet, and a few hands went up again. "That's the problem we're here to solve," Marcus said. "It's not about pointing fingers. It's about understanding that we're all human, and we all make mistakes. But we have the power to do better together." The workshops became a regular event, drawing larger crowds each time. Officers who had once been defensive began opening up, sharing their struggles and listening to the concerns of the community. Residents, in turn, learned more about the pressures officers faced, fostering a new sense of empathy. Even the young officer who had pulled Marcus over attended one of the sessions. Marcus spotted him in the back of the room, his posture less rigid than before. After the session, the officer approached Marcus, his expression earnest. "Mr. Price," he began, "I just wanted to say I'm sorry. I've been thinking a lot about what happened, and I realize now that I was wrong." Marcus offered a small smile and shook the officer's hand. "Apologies are the first step. Now let's focus on what you do next." Months turned into years, and Marcus's initiative grew beyond the town, spreading to neighboring communities. His efforts caught the attention of state officials, who invited him to speak at law enforcement conferences and advise on policy reforms. But for Marcus, the real reward came in the small moments: an officer choosing dialogue over force, a community member stepping up to bridge the gap, or a young recruit entering the field with a newfound sense of responsibility. Marcus knew he couldn't change the world overnight. But if he could inspire even one person to think differently, to act with empathy and integrity, then every effort was worth it. Years later, as Marcus sat on his porch with Rufus by his side, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. The road hadn't been easy, but it had been meaningful. The officer from that day was now a sergeant, known for his fairness and dedication. And the community? It was stronger than ever, bound together by the lessons they had all learned. Marcus took a deep breath, the evening air cool and refreshing. He had spent his life fighting for justice, and even in retirement, he had found a way to keep the fight alive. As the stars began to dot the sky, Marcus smiled to himself. The work wasn't done, there was always more to do. But for now, he was at peace, knowing he had made a difference. The soft hum of the engine filled the car as Marcus guided it back onto the highway. The world outside his window was painted in the warm, golden hues of late afternoon, but his thoughts remained focused on the events of the day. The young officer's behavior, the assumptions he had made, and the power dynamic that had shifted it all played back in Marcus's mind like a reel on loop. But for Marcus, this wasn't a story of frustration or anger. It was a story of opportunity, a chance to reflect on the path forward not just for himself, but for everyone who carried the weight of authority without fully understanding its responsibility. Marcus had always believed in the ripple effect, the idea that a single action, whether kind or careless, could spread outward and touch the lives of countless others. He thought back to the moments that had shaped him, the mentors who had guided him in his early years with the FBI. Their lessons hadn't been about power or control, they had been about service, humility, and the courage to admit when you were wrong. He could see echoes of his younger self in that officer. There had been a time when Marcus, too, had been quick to judge, quick to assert authority without taking the time to understand the bigger picture. But life, with all its complexities and contradictions, had a way of humbling even the most confident among us. As he drove, Marcus wondered, had today planted a seed of change in the young officer's mind? Would this encounter linger in his memory, shaping the way he treated others in the future? Marcus couldn't be sure, but he hoped so. The road stretched on, a long ribbon of asphalt winding through the quiet countryside. Marcus thought about how far the world had come and how far it still had to go. He thought about his grandchildren, their bright smiles and curious minds, and the kind of world he wanted to leave behind for them. This wasn't just about one officer or one encounter. It was about a system, a culture, a collective mindset that needed to evolve. Change was slow, often frustratingly so, but Marcus had seen it happen before. He'd seen communities heal, trust rebuilt, and bridges formed where once there had been only walls. Later that evening, as Marcus sat on his porch with Rufus at his feet, he found himself thinking about what he would say if the officer from earlier were sitting across from him now. He imagined a young man, looking unsure but willing to listen. Respect doesn't come from a badge, Marcus would say. It comes from the way you treat people, especially those who don't look like you or live like you. Authority isn't about being in charge, it's about being responsible for your actions, your words, and the way you carry yourself. He'd pause, letting the words sink in. Everyone makes mistakes, he'd continue. What matters is what you do after. Do you double down, or do you take the lesson and grow? Marcus smiled faintly at the thought. He had learned that the best lessons weren't the ones taught with anger or punishment, they were the ones taught with patience and understanding. Over the years, Marcus had seen firsthand the power of mentorship and education. He thought back to the programs he'd started after retiring from the FBI, workshops that brought together law enforcement and community members to foster dialogue and understanding. He remembered one particular session, a young recruit standing up to share his story. The recruit had talked about how he'd grown up in a neighborhood where police were viewed with fear and distrust. Joining the force had been his way of trying to change that narrative, but he'd quickly realized how easy it was to fall into the traps of stereotypes and assumptions. It wasn't until I sat down with people from my community, the recruit had said, that I really understood what it means to serve and protect. It's not about power. It's about trust. Marcus had been proud of that recruit, just as he was proud of every officer and community member who had chosen to do the hard work of listening, learning, and growing. As the stars began to appear in the night sky, Marcus felt a sense of peace wash over him. He knew the road ahead would still be long and challenging, but he also knew that every step forward mattered. The young officer from today's encounter might never fully grasp the impact of their meeting, but Marcus didn't need him to. What mattered was that a seed had been planted, a moment of reflection that could grow into something larger. Marcus leaned back in his chair, the cool evening air brushing against his skin. He looked out at the horizon, the endless expanse of sky, a reminder of how vast and full of possibility the world truly was. In his years of service, Marcus had learned that the loudest voices weren't always the strongest. True strength came from quiet conviction, from knowing who you were and standing firm in your values. It's not about being right, Marcus thought. It's about doing what's right. And that, he realized, was the lesson he hoped to pass on, not just to the officer from today, but to everyone he encountered. The journey wasn't over, not for Marcus or for the world around him. There would be more challenges, more misunderstandings, and more moments where patience and resilience would be tested. But Marcus was ready. He had spent a lifetime learning how to navigate the complexities of human behavior, and he wasn't about to stop now. As he closed his eyes, the gentle rhythm of Rufus's breathing beside him, Marcus felt a quiet satisfaction settle in his chest. The work would continue, and so would he.